Alright, so this is where we left off, and this is the final image that we have. Okay, so this is pretty much it. As I said, I won't be doing the floor shader, so you can kind of decide what you want to do with that. The only thing I want to do with the floor right now is I just want to make it slightly darker, so the rest of it kind of gets highlighted. So I'm just going to take the basic shader and just lower the diffuse. Yeah, lower the diffuse weight so it becomes a little darker, so that the plates kind of stand out based on that. What I want to do with this lesson is I just want to talk a little bit about some of the technical aspects on how you can speed up the render time. So I did a few renders and a few settings beforehand, so I won't waste too much time, but we'll just talk about it to get a better idea of how you can optimize the Redshift rendering time. So primarily a couple of things. The first one being sampling, and the second is something called as ray reserved memory. So let's deal with ray reserved memory first, and then we'll deal with the sampling bit of things. Okay, so in order for that to happen, I'm going to turn off IPR progressive. And what you want to do is come to the Redshift part, and in the end you will find memory. Okay, and you have something here called ray reserved memory. So what this does is that by default it's at 0. But if you have a graphics card which has a decent bit of RAM, okay, and you sort of want your scene to be stored into that RAM, I'm not entirely sure what it does, but if you give it a decent bit of RAM to store the scene in, it sort of speeds up the rendering. You can read about it in more detail in the help section. I kind of read about it. I couldn't really get the technical aspects of it, but the simple thing to remember is that if the more RAM you give it, the faster the rendering gets, because it's sort of just caching everything to RAM. So just to sort of do this once, what I'm going to do is I'll just come to the settings, and I am at 16 by 256. Let me do one thing. I'm going to take the adaptive threshold and take it up to 0.03. So it should be relatively fast, and let me hit a render. Okay, so this is a proper render. We've turned off progressive, and then I'll just show you the various settings. Okay, so let this render through, and then we'll come back. Alright, so that took about 1:14 to render. Now it's a little grainy because I increased the adaptive error threshold, but this is 1:14. Now if I come to the memory, and let's say I'll just stop this and I'll increase the memory to 512. Now the one thing you have to remember is that you need to have a graphics card which has a decent bit of RAM on it. Like I have a GTX 1080 which has 8 GB. So that gives you like a decent bit of RAM that you can play with, because this scene I'm pretty sure is not taking up too much RAM. So you have a lot of free RAM left for you. And also if you have a bunch of other things running, then it could cause a problem. But if we do it at 512, so the previous one was like 1:14, and if I render it now, alright, so with no ray reserved memory, we were at 1:15, and with 512 MB, we are at 1:13. Now that doesn't really drop it a lot, but that's also because I've lowered the settings a lot. So this is rendering pretty fast, and it's also really grainy. But to show you the settings at like default, which was at error threshold of 0.01. So if you read up here, you can kind of see how much it drops. So when I started off at 0 at a default setting of 16:256 and 0.01, I got 2:11. So at 512 MB, I dropped down to 2:06. By 1024, I'm at 1:52. So you can see a fairly big drop between the 2:11, like at 0 and 1024. Like that gives you a fairly big drop. So you're pretty much saving about 20 seconds over there. But beyond that, then the drop is not as much as you expect. Like between 1024 and 2048, it's basically about 6 seconds, and then between 2048 and 4096, it's just 2 seconds. Okay, so after a certain point, the returns aren't as much as you would expect. Okay, so I think like 2048 is a good amount to keep. Don't go more than that, you're not seeing too much, and it also might just eat up too much RAM from your graphics card, which you might need for other purposes. But just to do it here, like this is 1:15, And let's do one thing. Let's take the ray reserved memory up to 2048 and do a final render, and so we can check. Alright, so we got a pretty decent difference here. Okay, so from 1 minute 15 seconds it dropped down to 1 minute. Okay, so this is a 640/480 render. So you start doing bigger renders, you will get a fairly big difference. Plus, as I said, like our settings are pretty bad. Like adaptive threshold shouldn't be at 0.03. That's giving me a fairly grainy image. Like you can see, like there's a fair bit of noise in the background. But that's the one thing you need to remember. Okay, like which is always give a little bit of ray reserved memory. It will help speed up the render time. The other thing which is definitely more important or equally important is the unified sampling. Okay, now most of the times I play with unified sampling unless you have like one odd light which is causing you issues and you need to increase the sampling just of that. But usually I'm just happy playing with minimum maximum samples. Now in this case, let's do one thing. I'm going to take this up to 2/3 resolution, so it's a fairly big render, and let's hit render, and then we can start adjusting things. Yeah, I'm going to just draw a region here because that's like the most grainy area because you have like a fair bit of depth of field and stuff going on in there. So the way unified sampling works is you have your minimum samples and maximum samples, and there's something called an adaptive threshold. Alright, so what it does essentially is when you say minimum samples of 16, that means the entire scene is at least going to get 16 samples. Then what you do is you keep something called the adaptive threshold, and as the render engine keeps rendering the image, it sort of checks the pixel for when it is going to reach this threshold. Okay, now what it is saying is like the minimum amount of noise that it can accept is like 0.03, or let's say this is 3% of noise. So 1 being like 100% of noise and 0.03 being like 3% of noise. So what it's saying is if the pixel has reached the 3% noise, I won't put any more samples on it. So maybe if it's like majority of your scene is diffuse and you just have a couple of like glossy objects in there. So let's say majority of your scene is clean or reaches an adaptive threshold of 0.03 by 64 samples itself. So it won't go all the way to 256. It'll just do 64 over there and stop. Okay, but the other two objects which are glossy, maybe they need full 256 to reach the 0.03, so they will get 256. But that's also like a maximum limit. Maybe they need more than that. But since you've kept that limit, it will only go to 256. Okay, and that too at the noise level. Okay, so if it feels like that glossy object reaches the noise threshold of 0.03 by 128 samples, then it won't put 256. Okay, so you're not actually using all of it. It only uses all of it if it is necessary. Okay, if it feels like I'm not reaching that threshold. So these two are important, but this is a little more important. Okay, because lowering this means that it will start like maybe you have 1,000 samples, but if your error threshold is too high, it won't use the entire 1,000 samples. Traditionally, the error threshold is kept at 0.01. Okay, let me just sort of do a snapshot of that, and you'll see a fair bit of quality difference as well. So this is 0.01. See, so this is a lot more cleaner than what we were getting before. So same number of minimum maximum samples, but the adaptive error threshold is more important. Now, the decision that you need to make is how much noise is acceptable to you. Like you can go pretty low, like you can go to 0.001, okay, which will shoot up your render times to like an insane amount. Okay, so this is like, just to show you, this is 23 seconds. And then if I do a snapshot of this, and if you do 0.03, you'll see a fair bit of speed difference. Like 0.03 will be a lot faster. It will be noisier. It will be a lot faster. So you can sort of make out like over, see like these areas, especially like this area. Okay. See, that was 10 seconds and this was 23 seconds. Okay. Or 14 actually. See, so you can see like under the spoon, there's a lot of like, it gets really clean under the spoon. So yeah, so the noise threshold is pretty important, but just keeping it low and if you don't have enough max samples is not going to help either. So you have to do sort of a balance of both. So I kind of realized like 0.01, and for this particular image, I kept it to 512 and I was, pretty happy with that. So yeah, the point is, don't go overboard. It again, as I said, like a lot of it depends upon you. Yeah, like some people like the image to be like super clean, and that's fine. So you can sort of just shoot up the samples too much. But if you feel like you have a fair bit of textures and you can get away with a little bit of noise, then it's fine. Don't increase it too much. Okay, like usually I have never gone over 1024 samples, and my adaptive threshold is usually at 0.01, and I've usually been perfectly happy with that. So just to show you, like, time differences. Okay, so this is 960 540 and I'm doing 64 by 512. Okay, so you can see like the speed difference. So 0.005 adaptive threshold. There is a fairly huge difference. This is like a 2-minute difference between the two. So 0.01 is 4 minutes 37 and 0.005 is 6 minutes 41. Like here itself, you can see the difference between like 16 by 512 got us up to like 30 seconds, and 256 was down to about like 20 seconds. So we got like a 10-second difference, which is pretty huge. Okay, that's like a 30% jump. So yeah, so keep these two things in mind. The ray reserved memory, always increase it. Okay, but never too much. Okay, like as I said, like above 2048, I found the returns to not be very effective. Like it's just a 2-second difference. Maybe for massive scenes, you might find a bit of a difference, but for this one, like I'm okay here. But what was happening was that when I increased it, I would also find like the browser starting to get a little slow, because maybe it's just picking up all the RAM from the graphics card. So things would start getting a little slower. Okay, so yeah, this will affect that. So when you put it for final render, just don't use your machine. I guess that will be a good idea. Okay, or have like a secondary graphics card just for browsing purposes. And then the sampling is kind of up to you. Like whatever noise level is acceptable to you, you kind of work with that. But just remember, like the lower you drop that adaptive threshold, the time jumps are pretty massive. Okay, so you have to be careful about that. So that's basically it. So this is the entire, let me just hit IPR so we can at least see the full image. So we'll just do that. And yeah, so let this render, so we can just see it. Okay. But that's basically it. So this is as far as, the entire course is concerned. The main focus was never so much on, the rendering technicalities, or I haven't done anything with passes. I don't really do a lot of passes nowadays. Since the render engines are fast enough, I kind of go like, okay, if I can get the effect, majority of it like in camera, I'll just do that. And then I do a little bit of post-production in Photoshop. Like that's usually my method. I don't do a lot of mixing between live action and 3D. So yeah, I don't do a lot of passes anymore. Okay, but yeah, the primary focus of the training was always on trying to build a variety of complex shaders, because I think that's the most important thing. Like everything else is technicality, right? The passes and the tweaking of the render settings, all of that is like, technicalities. If you don't have good looking shaders, your image is still going to look terrible, no matter how well you understand the technicalities of the renderer. So the focus of this one was always, let's build good looking shaders. So once you're happy and confident with that, the rest of it you can figure out. So I hope in that regard, the training was helpful. All right, so that's basically it. So if you have any questions regarding this training, or any other questions in general regarding Houdini, feel free to ask me. You can ask me in the comment section on Vimeo. You can write me an email, or you can ask me on Twitter. I don't know, 140 characters are enough to ask a question or not. But yeah, like whatever method is preferable to you of any of those three, you can write and ask me. And I will try to answer within the best of my knowledge. So as usual, I hope this training was useful, and that's basically it.